The Transition Town movement is gaining both momentum and followers. I went to meet Alexis Rowell on his homegrown balcony to find out more about what this increasingly popular movement has to offer. If we could start with you explaining what the Transition Town actually is.
When I first started thinking about climate change and peak oil, the end of cheap oil, I started going around saying, look, catastrophe is coming. We need to do something. It was like I had two big loaded guns and I was going, one is the moral argument, climate change is coming, we've got to do something, and the other is industrialised society is going to hit a wall because cheap oil is going to go away. That didn't work very well, to be honest. People switched off, they said, oh, it's someone else's problem. They just didn't engage. Then I found the transition movement. The transition says something slightly different. It turns it on its head and said, well, actually, what we've got today, this polluted, stressed, chemical society where people don't know their neighbours, where trust is broken down, where community is not functioning properly, that's not what we want, is it? So if you revision society to be something more positive, by and large, what people do is they design out the carbon. They design out the problems that are creating climate change. They design out the issues that are going to cause us such trouble when oil becomes really cheap. So that seems to me to be a really, really positive way to frame the dramatic changes that we're going to have to undertake. And transition does a second thing. It gives you a space to be able to deal with the traumas of climate change and peak oil. Because it's all about rebuilding community. It's all about having a group of people doing stuff, showing that there's a better way to do these things, but also to give people space to deal with the trauma of dramatic change.
What exactly goes on in Belsize's Transition Town?
Well, it's been going for just over a year now, about a year and a half, and it's quite amazing how many different groups there are actually in Transition Belsize, working on everything from food growing to draft busting of houses to putting solar panels on people's roofs to knitting and sewing and making and mending. One day in January I reflected on the absolute wonderfulness of having spent, in the previous week, I'd had 15 people come around to my flat to do draft busting. So 15 people having fun, doing all the windows and doors to make sure drafts weren't getting in and learning in the process. Then I went to a knitting, sewing, making and mending evening and I learned how to darn my socks and turn up my trousers in the company of a lot of people having a really good time. And then on the Saturday I learned how to make a book from scratch, basically from recycled paper and card. And so that's the essence of transition. People doing stuff, positive manifestation of the project, if you like, physical manifestation of the project, but doing it in community, not one person doing this, one person doing that, because we've become very solitary as a human society. We're not very good at doing things in groups anymore. And I think people are crying out for community. And if you reframe what we need to do about climate change and the end of cheap oil in terms of enhancing community, then I think people are much more positive about doing it. To do food growing, and if you look behind me, this is my sort of food growing space, and it goes all over my balconies. I've got peas, I've got carrots, I've got lavender for the bees, I've got rocket here. Oops, that was a rocket plant. This sort of thing, you don't need to know about peak oil and climate change to be able to get excited about food growing. Similarly, you don't need to know anything about the North Pole melting or the fact that we haven't got enough power to run the national grid to be able to get interested in putting a solar panel on your roof. So for some people, it doesn't really matter what the big issue is. The fact that there's community and there's friendship and there's trust and there's people doing interesting things, that's enough.
You mentioned community. How do you think faith communities fit into the Transition Town concept?
I think we need to find ways to engage with all sorts of networks, and faith communities are a particular sort of network where traditionally they haven't been very good at the sustainability agenda. They've been quite slow to pick it up. The Church of England and the Jewish community are starting to pick up the climate change issue. I don't think either of them are really dealing with the end of cheap oil. But here you've got a network which is good for transmitting information and for helping people to change. If a rabbi says something, if a vicar says, if the Pope came out and said climate change is the biggest issue facing human society, then surely that would have an effect on people. So what I'd like to try to do in amongst all the groups that are working on staff in transition Belsize is I'd like to set up an interfaith group. Not so much to get the faiths working together, although that would be a great thing, but to get them to do some of the things that we're doing in transition Belsize. You know, we've got a foraging group that goes up to Hampstead Heath to learn about different types of edible plants. We've got a food production group that's making Belsize pestos out of basically weeds that we find on the heath. We've got a garden share project looking at taking front gardens that aren't being used anymore and finding people that want to run allotments and then matching those two up. We're going to turn the front of Belsize Park Tube into a food growing showcase. So there are lots of things that faith groups can engage with to do things. You know, this is not about talking. This is not about debating. This is not about sitting around and saying we need to change the world. This is about getting on and doing stuff as a community. Now, faith groups are already a community, so if we add to it the understanding of these big, huge issues that are facing our society, and add to it the things that we can do, then I think we've got a huge forward movement.